What's up, guys? Tom here from Metalloud, and I'm here to talk about a movie that was kind of poorly critically received that I really think doesn't deserve all the hatred that it's been getting. And that movie is Ghostbusters 2. Now, when this movie came out, people really seemed to reject it. It wasn't as good as the first one. It felt like a kind of cheap cash grab. Critics didn't like it, and fans didn't really like it. But I never saw why. I grew up on both of these movies. Ghostbusters 2 I watched a little bit later in my life for reasons I'll explain in a little bit, but I never understood why the movie was as hated as it is. I honestly didn't even know it was as hated as it is until much more recently with the controversy surrounding the new Ghostbusters movie. I always thought that Ghostbusters 2 was held in high regard, as much of a classic as Ghostbusters 1 was, but apparently not. So this is In Defense of Ghostbusters 2. Now, one of the main criticisms that people seem to have about this movie is that it's almost a beat-for-beat remake of the original. It hits all the same action points, all the same plot points, and I can kind of see that, but I don't really come to the same conclusion that necessarily makes it boring or a bad movie or a cheap cash-in or anything like that. I mean, the critics like Roger Ebert hated this movie. Fans seem to not like this movie either, as I mentioned, and that's what I kind of want to talk to you about. I want to start with that, about it being a shot-for-shot or beat-for-beat remake of the original movie. So starting off with this movie, we get the Ghostbusters kind of in a low point. It starts off, the first time that we see them is we get a shot of the Ecto 1 careening down these roads in New York City, and there's smoke coming out of the back. It's dirty, the logo's fading, and you think they're chasing, after a ghost or something, that they're back in the swing of things, but they're just entertainment at a kid's party, and the kids don't even like that. They start shouting for He-Man. And the comparison is that in the beginning of Ghostbusters, the original movie, they're kicked out of the Columbia University, they're not doing too well, they have no money, they have nowhere to go, and they're starting them at the same point. But here's the thing, that's probably the best place that they could have actually started them, because think about it, this movie is coming many years after the first one, and there's only so many places that they could have started this off as. They could have started them on the top of the world, doing great, and then it kind of been the opposite arc as the original. They're starting off great, they're doing great, something happens, they get separated, they break up, whatever, and then they reunite it back at the end. That could have been Ghostbusters 2. Instead, we get them starting at the bottom of things and the low end of things, and I think that was the perfect point that they could have actually started them at this movie. It kind of gives them a place to build up from, and plus it's more realistic. I mean, as realistic as you can be in a movie about fighting the paranormal with nuclear accelerators on your back, but to me that's kind of where, if anything, I would have expected it to have started, especially that coming that long after the original movie. Because if you really think about it, people in New York City especially, after that happened, they're going to kind of get angry. They're going to have the government suing them, the people not liking them, and it's not really going to go well for them unless some miraculous thing happens and they suddenly have a ton of business and people respect them. But let's face it, chances of that happening were very, very slim. So of course it starts off introducing the characters kind of one by one. We first get to see Dana Barrett, who we find is kind of the main character again, at least to the main victim, I guess you can call her. All the paranormal stuff is happening to her. In the beginning, you find her with her baby, and the carriage kind of goes out of control, and eventually it comes to a stop, and she goes to see Egon. You get to see Ray and Winston, the ones that went to the children's party, and then, you get to see Venkman a little bit later, but you kind of, from the actual conversation, it's nice that it starts off because it recaps what happened in the original. It also recaps what happened in between the movie, so you kind of get a sense of what actually happened, what went on, the fact that they're kind of a team, but not really so much a team, that they all kind of moved on in general to different things, and, Egon's doing his experiments, Bankman has his talk show basically about weird stuff and paranormal stuff, and he's still that kind of oily used car salesman type character that you get. It's a slow kind of introduction to the crew before things actually start building up and actually start happening, and you get introduced to the main villain and the main villain's puppet, essentially Vigo, the painting, and then Janos Poha. That's, I think, the right way to start things off. If they had started off at a high point, I don't think it really would have worked as well. I don't think that their chemistry kind of leads you to believe that they even would have stayed together as a team. And this feels like a natural progression of what happened after the first movie and the events of the first movie. So criticizing the movie for kind of starting off at that point, at least, I think is kind of just not right. I mean, it's really, I think it would have been more critical if they had actually started the opposite. And that's kind of the point I'm trying to make, is that despite the fact that, yeah, it is almost a beat for beat remake. It starts at a high point, then the monsters attack, and then they're called back into action, and everyone loves them again, and then there's a big showdown at the end. And, you even have the comparisons of the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man to the Statue of Liberty in Ghostbusters 2, but it works. It's what works. It's the formula that works, and you can say that they played it safe, but it worked. That's the thing. It could have turned out poorly. They could have done the same movie as Ghostbusters 1 and it could have come out absolutely terrible, but it really didn't. And that's why I think that it was a smart idea for them to have gone this route and made the same plot points, same beats, whatever you want to call them. And I really think that that's where they nailed it, was with that choice. The other thing is that this movie kind of tries something a little bit different than the first movie. The first movie wasn't really a scary movie in any way. It was more of a comedy than it was anything horrific or scary or even intense. I mean, it had its intense moments. I mean, there were certainly some scenes that were fairly horrific, like the arms coming out of the chair and pulling Dana into the refrigerator, and then even the beginning of the librarian scene is a little bit creepy, but there's nothing that's kind of outright scary. You never get this kind of overwhelming sense of dread. There are points in the movie where that kind of creeps to the surface, especially when you have the whole confrontation with Arnold Peck and Walter Peck, excuse me, and they shut down the containment grid, and the firehouse explodes. But it's really never to the point where it's actually scary or anything like that, or really terrifying. And Ghostbusters 2 actually takes a different route, and kind of from the beginning has this creepy sense to it, and a lot of that is actually in the score of the movie. I would say the score kind of takes a creepy tone from the first one's more whimsical tone at most of the time, and it takes a much more serious kind of synth tone to things. But just in general, I mean, you're introduced to the actual villain almost immediately in the movie, with the painting Vigo coming to life and taking over Janos Poha, and you really, from the beginning, there's this overwhelming sense of just dread. You have the slime under the city, you have the Vigo painting coming to life, you have just a lot going on. So this movie wasn't trying to emulate the original and copy it. It really was trying to do its own thing. It took a more serious tone to things. I mean, besides the painting Vigo, which used to kind of terrify me as a kid, you had the bathtub scene where the slime tries to eat the baby. You have the Janos Poha ghost that was right out of Wizard of Oz, and just really terrifying in general. I mean, even this whole courtroom scene in the beginning with the Scalari Brothers is just way creepier than any of the ghost scenes in the original movie, and they really upped the horror elements in this movie versus the original one. So they were trying to at least do something different. So that's why I don't think it's really fair to kind of criticize the movie for going the route that it did, because it really did try to blaze its own path. It did try to do things a little bit differently. I mean, Unfortunately, one of the things that kind of suffered a little bit was the comedy. A lot of the comedy in the original movie was derived from kind of the banter, especially from Bill Murray and his kind of improv lines and his just dry delivery and dry wit, but the whole crew as well. I mean, everybody kind of had that dry wit about them, and that's part of what gave the movie a lot of its charm. Also, the fact that I really don't think they knew the movie was going to be as big as it did. It seems earnest. It seems like they were, they had their hearts into it, and it doesn't feel like they were too full of themselves to know that this was going to be as a successful movie as it was. And I think Ghostbusters 2 kind of suffers a little bit from, it feels like at that point they realized what they actually had on their hands and the franchise that they had. And some of the humor kind of suffers for that. It's not quite as funny as the original. The comedy is not as quirky, but at the same time, what you lack in that department, and it's still a funny movie. I mean, there's still definitely some pretty funny scenes in there. Again, especially driven by Bill Murray in general. But what you trade and what you actually get is you get more memorable scenes. I mean, Ghostbusters, the original, is memorable for the lines. There's so many lines that are quotable, especially within context, and that's what that movie is really kind of driven by, is those quotable lines, those quotable scenes. Oh, where do the stairs go? They go up. Lines like that just kind of really brought that movie to its greatness. And Ghostbusters 2, on the other hand, not so memorable with the actual lines, but there's so many more memorable scenes themselves. I mean, like I just said, the whole thing with the Scalari Brothers in the courtroom scene, the bathtub, the Janos ghost, the Vigo painting itself as a villain. The original had the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. That's the thing everybody knows from Ghostbusters, is Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. Even if you really haven't even seen the movie, you probably have heard that at some point. You probably know about that. Ghostbusters 2, the Statue of Liberty coming to life and controlling it with an NES controller, the toaster. There's so many more scenes in there that stick out, that are memorable, that were interesting visually and were entertaining than you got in Ghostbusters, the original movie. And so it's a bit of a trade-off, but again, the movie is doing something a little bit different. It is its own movie, despite the fact that it may have copied the blueprints of the original Ghostbusters, which again, I think was the right call and the smart move. It still tries to be its own thing, and I don't think you could really criticize the movie for just trying to do that itself. I mean, it really worked. Lastly, one of the other criticisms that people kind of throw at this movie is that it was a cheap cash grab, or they were just trying to capitalize on everything. And you're talking about it coming at the point where the cartoon show was kind of a big thing. Everyone knew Ghostbusters. It was a household name. It was pretty much riding high, and they could have done this movie at any point, but here we are. And I kind of can see there's a lot of moments in the movie that stand out, like they're trying to sell things. Again, the Statue of Liberty with the NES controller, for instance, is one of those where clearly that was designed to try to sell things. The slime being used as a instead of the proton packs, clearly again designed to sell toys and things, and you know what, that's not a bad thing. They worked in the movie, they worked it into it, the script was solid, the way they were introduced doesn't feel like they were just kind of cheap gimmicks or anything like that. They felt natural in the sense of the actual movie and in the context of the actual movie itself. And yes, I can definitely buy that or see that it was a bit of a cash in. It was definitely a movie that was made to make money. It didn't necessarily need to be made, even though people were definitely asking for it. We always wanted a sequel to that Ghostbusters movie. But what they gave us was a great movie. It was still had the, obviously doesn't compare to the original. That's almost a given. I mean, it's hard, especially when you're coming that long off of especially for a comedy movie. Comedies really aren't known for their sequels. I mean, you have some here or there that do things better, improve on things, but generally speaking, comedy movies don't do well when they have a sequel, and the further and further they get out from the original, the less likely it is to actually be successful. And I think Ghostbusters honestly managed to kind of ditch that trend. It didn't excel, it wasn't, anything that achieved greatness. It didn't do anything better than the original movie, but it didn't necessarily do anything worse. And it really, I don't think, was necessarily a copy either. It was its own thing. It was trying to be its own thing. It did its own thing, and it worked. I mean, that's the most I can get out of it. It was a very competent movie. It was everything that we could have asked for out of a Ghostbusters movie. It had our characters. It had the science. It had the humor. It played everything serious, which is one of the biggest things that made the original Ghostbusters a success, was that it played everything straight. The fact that they're shooting ghosts and capturing ghosts. I mean, that sounds like, especially when you say that's a comedy movie, the first thing I would think of something completely over the top, or something like Disney's Haunted Mansion, something like that, just completely ridiculous. And the fact that they played it so straight is why that comedy works, and they did it again in the second one. It's just why everything about it works. I mean, they upped the ante a little bit this time, so I don't understand why it's so hated the way it is. I can see the points that people are making with it. I can definitely understand their points, but I don't come to the same conclusion. I think that Ghostbusters 2 is a fantastic movie, and I will always defend it.